Good afternoon and welcome to, I don't know the exact number in the series of webinars that we've been hosting here at Community Giving. I think this is our 22nd webinar since the beginning of COVID, called Community Connections. We are absolutely delighted that you've taken time out of your day to join us and be with us today as we continue our exploration on the issue of equity. As some of you know, at Community Giving, after the start of COVID, we began doing webinars to stay connected in our communities. And in particular, following the murder of George Floyd, we turned our focus to diversity, equity, inclusion, and looking at how we as individuals, as organizations, and as communities could do a better job. And so first part of all of this has been listening to a number of people talk and help us all continue down this journey and learn more and ways that we could be better. We've explored a variety of different areas, and all of the areas we've explored, these webinars are available on our website at communitygiving.org. The previous webinars, which have been recorded. So if you happen to miss one of them and want to look back, you certainly are welcome to refer back to our recorded webinars. This one today will also be recorded and available and sent out following the end, but we are really very excited about today's topic. This came up early on and we wanted to make sure we talked about this area of equity in banking. And so we welcome you to this webinar today and glad you could join us. If you do have questions and answers, please put them in the chat in the bottom, and we will get to the Q&A probably after our speakers have had a chance to talk. But please send us your questions, and once again, welcome. And I'm going to turn things over to the Executive Director of the Brainerd Lakes Area Community Foundation, Carl Sant, who will introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone. We especially want to welcome our guests from U.S. Banks and Falcon Banks, John, Emily, and Marcus. So appreciate your spending your time with us and sharing your expertise in this area. So my pleasure to introduce Emily and Marcus. I'll start with Emily, who will be speaking after I'm done introducing them. Emily Koski is the Assistant Vice President at U.S. Bank, and she is in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategy Lead at U.S. Bank. Work includes streamlining strategic efforts in the area of workplace, community, supplier diversity, and marketplace and building programs that support diverse employees, including women, professionals of color, employees with disabilities, active military and veteran employees, and the LGBTQ community. Our strengths are inspiring people to deliver on a common vision and creating strategies that are both simple and effective. Emily holds a master's in voice performance from Wichita State University and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Musical Theater from Viterbo University in La Crosse, Wisconsin. She leverages her performance skill to infuse energy and creativity in all her work. So who knows, Emily may break out in songs I'm doing this. So. I also want to welcome Marcus Brown. He's a DEI strategy manager at U.S. Bank. Marcus serves as the U.S. Bank's DEI strategy manager, and in this role, he sets the Black employee segment in Business Resource Group strategy. Prior to this role, he served as the training and development program manager for U.S. Bank Corp Community Development Corporation. In this role, Marcus oversaw the development, delivery, and evaluation of DEI programs, leadership training, and manager and team engagement and business line trainings. Before joining U.S. Bank, Marcus held positions at Missouri Jobs with Justice and the Deaconess Foundation, working on systems level change for socioeconomic justice, child well-being, and improved health outcomes within the St. Louis metropolitan area. So please help me welcome Marcus and Emily, and Emily's going to start us off.
Hi, thanks so much for having us here today. Thank you so much for the introduction, Carl, and we are thrilled to be here, Marcus and I. So as he said, I'm Emily Koski. I work at U.S. Bank in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department. As the DEI strategy lead, my role is really to help bring several different strategies alive, but first and foremost, our overall DEI strategy, which is all about the mission to ensure that all of our stakeholders see, feel, and believe our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that means communities, our employees, our customers. And we do that by we do that by operating with 4 pillars. So the first one is community, and that's all about making sure that we grant money and sponsorship and volunteer with different organizations that are really committed to expanding equity in the communities they serve. The second pillar is supplier diversity. So making sure that we do business with minority-owned businesses, business leaders, and also that everyone that are our suppliers, we ask them to make sure that they are committed to DEI as well and how they operate. The third one is marketplace. So that is about our customers, making sure that we have products, services, that we are in the places and kind of marketing the places where our diverse customers are already visiting. So that's a really important part to growing our business, but also to serving our customers in the way that is really meaningful and relevant to them. And then finally, workforce. And that is a lot of the work that me and Marcus do. We talk about our employees and how do we make sure that we have equitable promotion and advancement opportunities, development opportunities, making sure we have the right benefits, the right policies in place so that everyone who is one of our 70,000 employees can succeed in their careers and do their very best work. And we do this all based on data. So every single time we start with a strategy, we look at the data. And this is in things like representation, promotion rates, engagement scores, turnover rates. And we take that data and we break it down by different employee segments or different cuts. And where there are discrepancies, where we see that people are having different opportunities or experiences. So for example, in our engagement survey, maybe the manager effectiveness questions. If we see that one group of employees is feeling the manager support in a very different way than other employees, we see there's a gap. And that's where we have decided as a bank, we are going to focus our efforts in closing those gaps and making sure that everyone is having the same kind of experience at the bank. And really, that gets to equity. So, you know, I know you've done a lot of discussion in this series about equity versus equality, but we were really intentional about calling ourselves the diversity, equity, and inclusion team, because equality is about giving everyone the same thing. Everyone has the same access to opportunities, the same development plans. And you can't expect everyone, unless they were all exactly the same, to all be successful when given the exact same kinds of support. So we're very intentional with the use of equity because that allows us to say, yes, we see a gap and we are going to overinvest in that area because we are giving individuals or groups of people what they need in order to be successful. And that has really allowed us to move this work forward. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Marcus Brown, to talk about himself and his role at the bank.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. So, you know, it's been really interesting to talk about my, you know, journey to the bank, as was mentioned a little bit in my bio preceding this segment was, you know, I've kind of had an unconventional path to the bank, if you will. I always call myself an accidental banker. But my focus in undergrad at Washington University was in urban studies, really understanding the built environment and how that impacts our lived experience. And then going to graduate school back at WashU again to get a master's in social and economic development. And I really thought I was going to go work for a developer in terms of how we're creating those built environments. But I found it to be very valuable working for a financial institution that can certainly speak to how we allocate and create access to capital, but also how we partner differently and measure the impact of those investments. And that's what really drew me to US Bank, having come from a grassroots experience in organizing for statewide campaigns, and then going into a foundation, understanding how those philanthropic dollars can really play a huge role in affecting the landscape in which we're operating in and out of. I really think that US Bank, in many ways, is doing so much of that, right? It is able to empower many of the folks in community through partnership and through our investments, but then also really thinking about how we are changing the social economic dynamic for a lot of our diverse segments. Particularly, I'll speak to what we've been doing for our Black community segment a little bit later. But again, in my role as our strategy manager for our Black employee segment, I work in tandem with our consumer strategy lead as well for our Black consumer segment to really have a holistic approach to how we are creating greater access to opportunity and to financial wealth building resources in their financial journey. And so we partner all across our enterprise, whether it be in HR or a number of our business lines and with senior leaders, activating this strategy and being able to cultivate and deploy a number of signature initiatives that really do allow for us to move the needle forward in that regard. One of the other things that I do in my role, in addition to setting the Black employee segment strategy, which is all about how do we attract, develop, and retain our talent, it is also to work hand in hand with our business resource groups. So our Black Heritage Business Resource Group are another channel in which we are able to activate our commitment to our employees' development, them being able to network and to just learn. And it's been an incredible space as of this year, as many of you all know, with the killing of George Floyd and as many of the others that have gone before him as well, unfortunately, it's for us to really ignite a space for us to have those conversations, to convene and to learn together. So that's a kind of a quick overview of my role. But what I'll go ahead and do now is really talk a little bit about some of those economic inequities that we know as a bank are incredibly important for us to address. McKinsey & Company, which we do have a partnership with for some of our leadership development programs, as well as some of our strategy work, has released some really great information built off of a lot of other data reports that really showcases the 10-to-1 wealth gap that exists between the median white family, which is that of 171,000, to that of Black median Black household, which is $17,150. And so we know that that large gap is creating a lot of economic constraint for people to experience any type of social economic mobility. To put that point, to underscore that point even more, we know that 28% of Black homeowners deferred their mortgage payments this year due to COVID-19, compared to only 9% of their white counterparts. And then lastly, 30% of Black respondents to a 2017 Gallup poll actually showcased that they had money in the stock market versus 60% of their white counterparts having stock in the stock market. So when we talk about, do we have money saved and set aside for a rainy day? Do we have those resources in place? We recognize that not everybody has those, and we're looking to identify and be more intentional about what we do as a financial institution to address that. We cannot talk about this year without mentioning COVID-19. It has disrupted all of our lives in a number of ways, and yet we know that it has also had very disparate impact on communities of color, particularly Black families and Black businesses. And so this year we were really candid about our support of that. We were working in tandem with our Community Development Corporation, which was able to issue out $50 million in additional funding for PPP to a lot of our community development finance institution partners, and many of which of them are Black-led and Black-owned community development finance institutions. So we're empowering not only those lending institutions, but also the smaller businesses in which they are supporting with PPP support. Additionally, we were able to put a lot of funding out there for PPE, as well as other ways in which our communities are recovering from COVID, particularly with our Minneapolis branches that were damaged shortly after some of the civil unrest that took place after George Floyd's killing. And we were able to deploy mobile branches to still make sure our customers, their needs were met. And ultimately what we recognize as a financial institution, we may not be able to solve racism as a whole, but we understand the role that we can play in addressing the racial wealth gap when it comes to creating access to financial wealth building resources. So those are products, services, and or experiences that we know are really important to making sure that that work takes place. One of the big ways in which we've been able to do that is being able to dedicate $100 million annually in additional capital to our African-American owned and led businesses. So when Emily was talking about what are we doing in the marketplace and community, really thinking about how we're empowering and supporting our partners, particularly our Black-led businesses and organizations. We also were able to dedicate $15 million of funds and community grants from our US Bank Foundation to support those who are suffering from recovering from COVID-19's impact. And then also, in addition to the support that we provided our CDFIs, we did another $1 million to our CDFI programs in awarding those grants for commercial loans to continue empowering them to focus on increasing their operational capacity so that they can do more. And so I think those are just some important things that, as you all are thinking about how banks in general are operating, really think about how US Bank is showing up to support some of the issues in which we know to be true. And really thinking about how we're leveraging our partnerships to be in a more accountable relationship with folks who are most impacted by financial challenges, but also really thinking about the ways in which we are serving as an accomplice in many cases to support them moving forward in that, and not necessarily feeling like we have to come in and own it, but to make sure that they're the ones seen as leading it and ultimately see us as a partner in it. And so with that, I'll go ahead and transition over to Emily, who can just maybe give you a little more context to some of the economic disparity that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the racial wealth gap. So Emily, go ahead and share a little bit more context there for us.
Thanks, Marcus. You know, a lot of the things that you hear about, even the things that Marcus shared, it's really hard to say, you know, for me at least, I'll be really honest and transparent. And I say, how did we get here? How did we get to the place where COVID is having such a huge impact on people of color in particular? Specifically our Black families right now. You know, Marcus talked a lot about, you know, the killing of George Floyd and just how that has reignited so much passion, and hopefully it'll be, you know, we'll make progress because of it. But how did we get here? What is kind of the history? And, you know, when we're talking about economic inequities, the big thing that, as I was kind of looking through and deciding what to share, is that this stuff is quite recent. Even if you think, you know, I'm going to kind of bring us back to, you know, before the 13th Amendment. So even, you know, when slavery started, it was illegal to, I mean, slaves, Black slaves, or African slaves at that point were property. They were not legally allowed to have assets or to build wealth or to have anything to their name. They were property. And then in 1865, you know, we abolished slavery as a nation, but it's still, even in the reparations stages, we still, Black people did not have the access to own property, which was really the way, and frankly, I would say is still the way, that a lot of people are able to build wealth, even today. So I was dusting off my cobwebs of when I was in school, and you know, I think maybe some of you remember the 40 acres and a mule, you know, that we learned about. And unfortunately, that was great in theory, but after Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson actually reversed that. And so, you know, we kind of tried as a nation, right, to say, yes, we realize that wealth building and being able to support yourself, you need land, you need property, you need to be able to own a plot of land. But we quickly reversed that and gave that land back to the Confederate owners, slave owners at the time. So then African Americans tried sharecropping. So what sharecropping is where they would go to these landowners who have reclaimed their land and rented spots, plots to farm. And as part of that, they had to pay a share of their crops to the landowners. Well, the contracts, many of them were written in a way where the plots were too big for the Black families to work the entire plot of land. So they weren't able to pay their share of the rent, and they actually ended up in debt to these white families. So rather than getting ahead, now we're still in debt. Then in 1935, we'll talk about the New Deal and kind of some laws that were put into place to help with the security and building wealth and supporting all Americans. Well, the Social Security Act was specifically written in a way that did not include farm workers or domestic workers. So that means maids or people who are farmers. So even those who did make success out of their sharecropping, maybe they were able to own farms, they still didn't qualify for those Social Security benefits. Again, it's a way to build wealth. It's a way to secure your future. It's a way to possibly have something to live on, and maybe, just maybe, you could pass something on to your kids or your grandkids. And many African Americans, 2/3 of them, never received any Social Security benefits. And another piece of that is in 1944, the GI Bill. So this helped with veterans from World War II to get things like tuition reimbursement, assistance buying a home. Education is a huge way that anybody, I think, gets ahead, right? In whatever field, it was shared that I'm a music major, right? So in any field that you want to go into, education is a really important pathway to get there. So in theory, oh, well, you're a Black veteran, use the GI Bill, tuition, education, make your choice, get her done. But in actuality, what happened was that most universities did not accept Black students. So the historically Black colleges and universities were overwhelmed with applicants. Ultimately, what happened, they took as many as they could, but only 20% of Black veterans who applied to use the GI tuition reimbursement benefit, only 20% were able to get an upper level degree. So, at the same time, you also have the Jim Crow laws that are really prevalent in the South. Things in that set of laws detailed what kinds of jobs that Black Americans could get, how much they could be paid. So all of these different things together limit the amount of wealth and the amount of assets that Black Americans could really accumulate over and above just trying to get by and to live. And all of this was until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I'm the first one to say, you can have a law, that's great, but it takes a long time for the effects to actually take place, which is what we're seeing, and we're still seeing here, as Marcus was sharing. But I think the big thing for me to point out is that, like I started with, this is not that long ago. This is one generation ago. And when, Marcus shared a lot about making sure that people have access to capital, which has been a real struggle. And, one big piece, I know that this group has talked about housing policy and housing inequities. And we cannot talk about the banking industry and wealth building or inequities in wealth building without talking about home ownership. And so next, I'm just going to talk a little bit about wealth building and home ownership, and then we can kind of wrap it up here. But, as recently as 2010, 30% of all household wealth in America, 1/3, was in home equity. That's like a lot. At the same time, Black families are 30% less likely to own a home. And if they do, they are 4 times more likely to be in areas and own a home in concentrated poverty areas. So what does this mean? So if you have a home, it's 1/3 of your assets. And what can you do? Why do we have a home? What do I mean when I say assets? You can leverage that equity in your home for things that help you get ahead. Things like education, things like investing in a small business, or other community type investments that could help you and your family get ahead. So if Black families are 30% less likely to own a home, and if they are, they're 4 times more likely to be in areas that have really depressed home values, then the biggest wealth building platform for families in the United States is very, very difficult to achieve and to use in a really important way to accelerate your progress and wealth building for our Black families. And even more so than that, again, like I said, this is one generation removed, all the effects of the GI Bill and Social Security and Jim Crow's law, one generation removed. And so when you think about it that way, 32%, and this is as of 2019, so as of last year, 32% of people who bought a home got help with their down payment from a relative. And 21% of those relatives, they were parents. Most of the relatives were parents. So if you're experiencing, you know, my parents' generation were experiencing all these hardships, all these roadblocks, then that has an adverse effect down the line where a third, or, you know, anywhere from a fifth to a third of the children, now adults, are struggling to find help with that down payment, let alone learning the ins and outs of home ownership, and that creation of wealth benefit from generation to generation just perpetuates. So the last thing I'll say is, you know, I've talked a lot about kind of the history and the implications, how we got here, but there's still a lot that we need to do in terms of even just our own biases in the workplace and in our community interactions. So, you know, when I talk about the workplace, I've shared that Marcus and I are really focused on our workforce, and there's still so much bias to overcome. As recently as 2002, there was a study, 5,000 resumes, identical, sent out, half with popular Caucasian names, half with popular African-American names. The African-American names were called back at 50% of the rate, so half the rate. And that equivalent is about 8 years worth of experience. Well, that's a catch-22. How are you supposed to get experience if you can't get a call back? So, you know, and as recently as last year, the unemployment rate for Black Americans was double that. In COVID, again, exacerbates that considerably, and pay for the same jobs was overall about 25% less. And this is, you know, nation overall, not necessarily in financial services. But those are some really intense obstacles to overcome. So what I'm really proud of, you know, when we talk about the banking industry and some of the things that Marcus brought up, what I'm really proud of is that we had been doing this work. We really have been doing it for a while, but we kicked it off last summer. So summer of 2019 is where we really got our Black leader employees together. We had a summit, an offsite, and said, okay, what can we as a bank do? What do we need to be doing? What are our responsibilities? And so even before this year started, which was, you know, just very intense, as Marcus shared, we have already been doing this work. I like to think that it kind of gave us a little bit of a leg up in a way, because then when COVID hit, when the killing of George Floyd happened in our headquarters market, we were able to then say, hey, we have everything in place. We're just going to ramp up our efforts. And so I am really proud of a lot of the things that Marcus said, in particular, you know, our commitment to our own employees and making sure that we really help with promotion, development opportunities, our commitment to the community, like Marcus shared, our commitment to CDFIs to really help with that funding piece for small businesses, because boy, those are the ways that you really impact wealth building that has an impact for generations. So I'll stop there. Marcus, if you have anything to add, please do before we turn it over to our next speaker.
Awesome. Yeah, Emily, I think you did such a great job just kind of covering some of those historical components to why we're here today. And one of the things that, you know, in addition to what I've mentioned already, that I'm really excited about is that US Bank continues to find ways to continue, like, digging its heels deeper in its commitment to DEI. And part of that is really encompassed by more place-based and long-term investments. One of the ones that I always like to talk about is Pullman Park on the south side of Chicago. And that really does underscore what we mean by having a place-based, kind of a long-term investment approach. You know, we invested over a 10-year period of time, $100 million. And we have seen the results to be true. 52% reduced in crime, 10% higher graduation rates, creation of 1,300 jobs, and 135 affordable housing units that were built in that community alone. This is just one of many of the types of deals in which we are able to go into and leverage our full suite of products and services and our relationships to really activate, because we know those challenges are real. And at the same time, we're keen on also changing the narrative. You know, we have all the data that talks about, you know, what our Black communities and individuals are at risk for. And yet there's so much to be celebrated. There are so many cultural assets within those communities and a number of things in which in partnership we can help to revive or to amplify, right? And so one of the things that I'm really excited about through this year, and we've had a string of years with our Community Development Corporation, where we have been given well over $60 million in tax credit finance allocation. And so if you don't know much about tax credit finance, community development, I won't go into a lot of detail about it. I can certainly geek out about it, but it's one of the main tools that we use to create affordable housing, to create economic development in business districts, to invest in renewable energy, and to invest in historic and restoration and renovation. And US Bank is one of the leading tax credit investors in the country. And so when we talk about the ways in which we're supporting our community, it goes beyond just the home, which, as we know, is a wealth building asset. It's what are we doing in community to surround that, right? In terms of employment opportunities, in terms of healthy access to healthy food and other resources that will allow a person's zip code and their race to not dictate their life outcome. And so these are the things in which we're excited about, whether we're working with our community development finance institution partners, whether we're working with our suppliers or small businesses to really think about the way we're investing dollars to build their capacity. All those things come into play. But first and foremost is that when we put people first, we know that there is more than just a data point and a number associated to a person, an organization, or community. It's about the person and their story and their aspirations. And we seek to be partners with them in that. So with that, I'll go ahead and close it out and see, if there are any questions, but I guess we're going to press pause on that until later on in the session. So with that, I'll hand it back to our moderator to go on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Marcus and Emily. You are right, we'll have some questions for you, but first I want to introduce John Herges. John Herges is the president and CEO of Falcon National Bank. He was previously the president of Stearns Bank until 2002, until he assumed his current role. He's been involved in a number of community initiatives here in the St. Cloud area, including United Way, the Chamber of Commerce, Downtown Council, Rotary, the Greater St. Cloud Development Corporation, and has served on the board of the Central Minnesota Community Foundation and CommunityGiving, Opportunities Matter, St. Joseph Bank Shares, Minnesota Business Finance Corporation, and the Benton Economic Partnership. John, you're a very busy man. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you very much, Carol. Good afternoon, everybody. I feel honored to be part of such a distinguished panel, and so I'm humbled by it. As president and CEO of Falcon National Bank, of course, I'm responsible for all areas of the bank, but including our compliance area. And in our compliance area, we watch and oversee and make sure that we're adhering to all of the regulations. And one of the regulations that came to my mind right away when I was asked to talk about this topic is the Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act was enacted in 1977, and it basically was created to encourage banks to help meet the credit needs of our communities. And so every 3 years, we have regulators come in and do an analysis and make sure that we're adhering to the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act. The act makes sure that we're lending to low and moderate low and moderate areas, also lending to low and moderate income levels, which is based on 80% of the median income. Also that we're lending to small businesses, and there they look at gross revenues under $1 million. And of course, we participate heavily in all the 504 loans, USDA loans, and that type of thing. And so that all qualifies for that. And then they also look at our donations in terms of going to low and moderate areas and income levels. And then our investment portfolio, they look at that and what kind of investments we're buying in terms of do any of them fall in the lower moderate areas of location or income. And then we also participate in the construction of multi-family units where we get into the tax credits, and that's something that Marcus mentioned earlier. The CRA area breaks banks into three basic categories. They have the small bank category, which covers from assets of 0 to just over 300 million. And then the intermediate bank level, which covers banks at a level of 300 million to a billion, a little over $1 billion. And then after you're over $1 billion, then you get into the large bank area. And as you move up the ladder from small, intermediate to large, the expectations become higher and higher. And there's a lot of reasons why we adhere to the CRA requirements. One of them is it's obviously the right thing to do, but they also have ratings that I mentioned we are examined every 3 years. As a matter of fact, we're going through an exam right today, and they've been in for the last month, and don't know what the results are, but I think they will be favorable. They rate a bank, and you either have an outstanding rating, a satisfactory rating, a need to improve rating, or a substantial non-compliance rating. And obviously, you want to avoid the need to improve and substantial non-compliance ratings. And there's some teeth to these ratings. So if you have a need to improve or a substantial non-compliance, they will not allow you to open up any branches. They will not allow you to acquire any other banks. They really can. The regulation does have some teeth in it if you do not comply. Obviously, we work hard every day trying to meet the needs of the communities that we're in. We think it's the right thing to do to be lending to all areas and not to red line or eliminate any particular area for one reason or another. So I'm pleased that over the years, Falcon National Bank has had a satisfactory or outstanding rating, and we intend to keep it that way. And and these ratings, by the way, are published. The public knows about them, and so if you're dealing with a bank and you want to and their adherence to CRA concerns you, look them up. The rating's there for the public to know, and then you decide. So that would be my comments, Carol, on the topic here today.
Great, thank you so much, John. I have some questions that have come in, so we'll get through some of those. And John, you had actually mentioned this about making sure that you were not redlining. And one of the questions is related to that. It says, what about redlining by bankers? What does your bank and what does US Bank do to currently to fight this history? So if you share it to give an example of how you make sure that redlining is not happening in your bank.
Yeah, Carol, again, when we're examined by the regulators for CRA, they look at what areas we're lending to, and they also look at what areas we're not lending to. And so if there's any trend there or indication that we're eliminating a particular geographic area over another, or that kind of thing, that gets to the redlining concept that I mentioned.
Great, thank you. And Marcus, can you tell me a little bit about US Bank?
Yeah, well, similarly, as U.S. Bank is a federally regulated institution, we adhere to a lot of those same compliance, primarily when we think about fair and responsible banking, as it relates to ensuring that there is no discrimination or abusive type of practices inherent to any of our policies as it relates to lending. But aside from that, our company is also very intentional about how we are thinking about our market share in terms of those multicultural markets where we know challenges for many communities of color are being underbanked or unbanked, right? So just being present is really important and making sure that our market share is there. But then another thing too is that we've also been very intentional over the years about how we are advancing home ownership. And I know we're in the final stages of a more comprehensive plan that I know will validate and really, I think, support our commitment and intention to how we address the ways in which we create access to homeownership for Black and Brown communities. And that is something that we are working very closely with and our partners internally, and know that it's going to be a meaningful shift in some of the work that we're doing as well. So aside from the compliance component, we're also being very intentional about the ways in which we're trying to meet people where they are.
Great, thank you. Another question has to do with our Muslim immigrants, and that when they're looking for home ownership, due to their interests, they often have to go out of state for Islamic home financing. So what is US Bank doing to help this immigrant group? Are there interest-free or equivalents that's being offered, or?
Well, I won't speak on that in a terrible detail, as I don't, work primarily out of our home mortgage department. So I can't speak to those things in particular, but I'd be more than happy to kind of follow up with you all about that by reaching out to some of our internal contacts.
That sounds great. Okay, another question. Do you have information of how inequities play out with other non-white or non-Black communities, such as Native Americans, Mexicanos, in general, the Latino immigrants and other immigrants? Is there any difference in the way that you handle things with them, or have you done any studies about how they are impacted?
So this really gets to our work. I shared earlier that yes, we have this overall DEI program. Marcus is the lead for our Black segment strategy, but we also have partners on the external side. So a lot of what we and Marcus do is focusing on the workforce. We have these partners on the external side for Hispanic, for we have a Native American strategy lead. We have several other strategy leads, and they are doing the similar kinds of research, kinds of community partnership, relationship building that Marcus has shared, and the similar kinds of investments that Marcus shared we're doing for the Black community. We do definitely do that kind of same work, and we do find that there are a lot of the same types of things that people in diverse communities come up against, the same kinds of roadblocks, whether that be bias, whether that be difficulty securing financing for homes or for other, small business as an example. So what we're doing strategically is really looking at this, a lot of the initiatives Marcus shared, where we're trying to, really focus on access for Black communities to their, building wealth. And as we learn with that kind of pilot in mind, then we believe that it will be very important to translate those learnings and next focus on the Hispanic segment, you know, the Asian segment. And so we're actually going to kind of continue our work based on the learnings of a lot of the work that we've been doing with our Black communities. Definitely very similar roadblocks.
Yeah, I would definitely just underscore, you know, the access is a continued theme when it comes to access to resources, but I think also in translation materials as well to their native language as well. And so it's really important when we're talking about financing. Heck, you know, even when we're talking, you know, in my first native language of English, even then sometimes the financing can be confusing. So we want to make sure that in that we're reducing any other barriers, right, from a language perspective as well, which we've been very keen on doing on our websites and materials to make sure that that is even accessible to them as well.
Great. Emily, you had mentioned about the 2002 study of 50% of the Black people being called back for interviews. And so we're curious, what does US Bank do to help to recruit a more diverse workforce then? And just give us a couple of examples, and then John, maybe I'll go to you and see how you're addressing that as well.
Sure.
So there are several things that we've put into place. Like I said, we've been doing this work for a while now. So over the past 2 to 3 years, we have implemented one, that all postings, and this is going to sound a little weird, but stay with me, that all postings of a certain leadership level and below, all jobs must be posted. And what that gets to is oftentimes you can fill leadership roles behind closed doors. Like, oh, you know, so-and-so is great, you should hire them. Okay, great. Thanks for the recommendation. And that prohibits access to women, to professionals of color, people who aren't in the political in crowd at work might not have access to even apply for those opportunities. So that's one of the first things that we did, is made sure every job has to be posted. Then we created a requirement for diverse candidate slates and diverse interview slates. So you could, of course, you know, say, yes, I have, you know, 1 African-American and 1 Asian in my 5-person pool, but then you want to make sure that there are people that represent those same diversities in the interview process as well, to, again, mitigate that bias. We also have materials for hiring managers before they go into a hiring process. And really the goal is check your bias. And even I'm in the middle of a hiring process right now. And even I review those, even though DEI is my day job, and just make sure I'm in the right mindset to make sure that there aren't any micro inequities or microaggressions or things that, oh, you know, this person looks like my aunt who I really don't get along with. I mean, these are all things that actually affect in a real way the hiring process. And then, you know, the last thing I'll say is that our recruiting team is starting to do work on actually looking at all the job descriptions. It's really easy to say, check the box, yes, I want a 4-year degree. And what they're doing is they're challenging that to say, do you really need a 4-year degree? When we phrase something this way, does it sound like it's more of a masculine trait, where a woman might say, oh, that doesn't sound like the job for me. So they're really going through and trying to make sure that the job descriptions don't put roadblocks in simply by arbitrary requirements that we may or may not need, that inadvertently put a whole pool of people out of range for being qualified for those roles. So those are a few things that we're doing. So both for internally and for external recruiting purposes, so that we can increase the number of diverse folks in our leadership ranks.
Absolutely. And 2 other things I would add to that is that we know why this work is so important, because studies have shown that women and people of color have traditionally, when they look at job descriptions, and they don't feel like they meet 100% of the requirements, don't even apply, right? They feel discouraged that they don't meet the requirements, so they don't really put themselves in the running for it. And so we know it's important to address that barrier too. The other part is that we activate the support of our diversifying our talent pipeline through our business resource groups as well. our business resource groups host a number of networking and professional and personal development sessions, ranging from job of the month sessions or really trying to get people involved in mentorship and sponsorship programs, as well as working in our communities in partnership with other organizations that allow us to have greater access and line of visibility into a more diverse talent pipeline as well.
And John.
Yeah, Carol, similar to what Emily was commenting on, you know, we're addressing it through our HR department and, you know, really becoming more open, more aware of getting people of color, not only in the lower ranks, but in the upper ranks of the organization. And I'm really proud. We recently hired a woman of color to be our market president in Ham Lake, and that's really exciting for me. I mean, I love that, and we've got to do more of that, and we will be doing more of that in the future.
Great. Another viewer mentions, I heard a competitor is implementing a forgivable down payment assistance initiative for people of color. Are you aware of other banks doing the same?
Carol, is that addressed to me?
That is addressed to you as well as to either Marcus or Emily who'd like to respond.
I have not heard that. I am not aware of that.
And I haven't heard of it either from a U.S. bank perspective. I know that obviously, you know, like Marcus said, we aren't in the lending or the mortgage departments by any means.
Right, right.
But we definitely do look at the marketplace. We look at competitors, and then we also look at, you know, what the impact is. So sometimes, and that's a fabulous program. And I'm not trying to, you know, dissuade people from looking into something like that, because that could really make a big impact on someone's life. But we also look at what would the impact be? How many people could this affect? And is this the right place to be focusing our efforts? Because Marcus also alluded to, you know, we have a really big project going on right now to talk about, you know, mortgages, just how we do mortgages in a really, really important sweeping way. So I'd like, you know, the way that U.S. Bank culturally tends to go for things is not necessarily, oh, we gotta keep up with that competitor. Oh, that's really flashy. We got to do that too. We more sit back and we're really thoughtful and say, okay, what's going to have the biggest impact for the most people? So I'm curious. I definitely will look into it.
Great. Just one last question then, and that is, I know that it sounds like you've done a lot already, but is there something out there that you're thinking about you'd like to be able to implement in the next year or two that really helps for those primarily rural communities to help with improving lending discrimination? Or is there something that you have done at U.S. Bank that you think is a simple strategy for rural communities to implement?
Well, one of the things, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things that I will say, you know, when we are not necessarily there in terms of having a branch presence, we certainly can always look to our partnerships with our community development finance institutions, of which we have done work with in the past, as well as those other minority depository institutions. I think primarily our bank is really keen on identifying how our partnerships can extend our influence and the ways in which we can lend. Those types of finance institutions in which we're partnering with and infusing capital into their organizations allow for them to then be able to make those micro loans and really support their communities as well. Now, what I'm not sure about is the extent of what that ratio of support looks like in the rural community versus more urban or suburban. So that's a great question, but I do know we are leveraging those types of partnerships to continue extending the types of ways in which we're supporting communities.
Great. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions, for presenting all of this information about banking. We're going to turn it over to Holly now.
All right, thanks, Carol. So I just want to mention that all the partner foundations who are part of Community Giving, Alexandria, Brainerd, St. Cloud, and Wilmer, all have response funds. Most of the nonprofits are aware of that. Just to let you know that all of these funds are at different points in transitioning into more of a recovery mode. And so if you have any questions, I encourage you to go to the website of your closest community foundation or contact your executive director. And they can just give you updates on grant deadlines, guidelines, anything you need to know about the grant process. So we are still granting, and we're just doing a little bit of a transition, most of us, with some of our grants. So please contact your local director. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Marcus and John and Emily, for being with us today. This has been an important conversation, and we really just want to thank you for coming on and being a part of the conversation that it will be ongoing. These have been very difficult times in our communities with COVID and the focus now on racial equity, and we want to continue the conversations. This is the last of our series here before the year end on this particular topic. We do have one more webinar next week on year-end giving, so that has more of a development focus. Actually, that will be on December 8th, and we invite you back for that. We are working on another series of webinars, and we're very excited that there's a vaccine and potentially a light at the end of the tunnel on COVID and staying at home. But we think that these conversations that we have with our communities is really important. And so we're going to continue with the series starting in January, and more information will be coming out about that. And we invite you to be a part of that discussion. We are always welcome to your input and ideas. You can email us at info@communitygiving.org. As we said, these are webinars are now available online and for you to refer back to or view, and that's also available at communitygiving.org. And we just want to thank you again, our speakers today, John and Marcus and Emily. Thank you so much. And for all of you who've taken the time to be a part of this conversation and view this webinar. We all know that we can do better in the area of racial equity, and we want to do better. We also know that with these trying times, it's important to reach out and support one another with what's going on in our communities. So thank you so much for what you're doing. Join us again for December 8th and in January for our new series, which will start after the new year. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you.